He was just a quiet black man, invited as a +1 to a high society wedding. He sat unnoticed, uncelebrated, a shadow in a room filled with blinding light. But when the arrogant white bride mocked him in front of everyone, calling him a nobody, the room filled with the ugly sound of laughter. What she didn't know was that this nobody was actually the billionaire CEO who signed her groom's paychecks. Before the night was over, she would be in tears, realizing the man she humiliated owned the company, her husband, and her entire future. Before we find out what happens next, tell us in the comments. Have you ever seen someone insult the wrong person? And if this story already has your blood boiling, hit that like button so more people see it. The reception hall of the Oakwood Country Club was a glittering jewel box of a room, a place where money was not just spent, but celebrated. Crystal chandeliers hung from the vaulted ceilings like frozen waterfalls, casting a warm golden light over the guests below. The air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and freshly cut peonies, a fragrance that mingled with the low hum of self-important chatter. Champagne flutes clinked together in a constant, delicate chorus, and the flash of professional cameras painted the scene in bursts of brilliant white. Every detail was perfect, meticulously crafted to project an image of effortless wealth and timeless elegance. Haley Monroe, the bride, stood at the center of it all, a vision in a designer gown that seemed woven from moonlight and pearls. Her smile was wide and practiced, a weapon she used to charm and command the room. She was the queen of this kingdom, and every person here was a subject in her court. Her gaze swept across the room, taking in the sea of familiar faces, the powerful smiles, and the admiring glances. Everything was exactly as it should be. Her new husband, Ryan, stood by her side, his arm wrapped possessively around her waist. He was handsome, ambitious, and on the right track at a major corporation. He was a perfect accessory to the life she was building. But then her perfectly curated vision snagged on something out of place. Near a back table, away from the main cluster of VIPs, sat a man who did not fit. He was a tall, composed black man, dressed in a simple but impeccably tailored dark suit. He wasn't talking to anyone. He wasn't laughing or drinking. He was just sitting, watching the room with an unnerving stillness, a quiet island in a loud and churning sea. He held a glass of water, turning it slowly in his hand, his expression calm and unreadable. Haley's perfect smile tightened at the edges. A flicker of annoyance crossed her face. Who was he? He didn't look like any of the executives or family friends she had personally invited. She leaned over to her maid of honor, her voice a sharp whisper beneath the music. "Who is that man over there, the one by the floral arrangement?" Her friend followed her gaze and shrugged. "I think he came with Sarah from accounting, one of Ryan's interns. He's her +1, I think." An intern's +1. The words dripped with insignificance. Haley's annoyance hardened into something colder, something like contempt. An intern's guest had been seated in the VIP section, a section reserved for family and senior partners. It was a flaw in her perfect design, a stain on her masterpiece of a wedding. The very sight of him, so calm and so out of place, felt like a personal insult. She couldn't let it stand. She detached herself from Ryan's arm, her movements suddenly sharp and purposeful. "Excuse me for a moment," she said, her voice retaining its sugary sweetness. But her eyes held a glint of steel. She glided across the polished marble floor, her gown rustling behind her like a sigh. The guests parted for her as she moved, a wave of deference following in her wake. She was a ship cutting through water, and her destination was the quiet man at the back table. Darius Cole saw her coming. He had been observing the dynamics of the room all evening, a silent study in human behavior. He saw the intricate dance of power and insecurity, the fake smiles and the genuine moments of connection. He had seen the bride, the center of this universe, and he had noted the proprietary arrogance with which she commanded her space. Now that arrogance was directed squarely at him. He didn't move as she approached. He simply watched her, his expression remaining neutral. She stopped in front of his table, looking down at him with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. It was a smile meant to disarm, but it was loaded with condescension. "Hi there," she began, her voice loud enough for the surrounding tables to hear. "I'm Haley, the bride. I don't think we've been introduced." The chatter at the nearby tables began to quiet down. People were turning to watch, sensing a shift in the room's energy. Darius met her gaze. "Darius," he said, his voice even and low. He made no move to stand. He simply acknowledged her presence, a gesture of basic politeness and nothing more. Haley's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. She had expected him to be flustered, perhaps to stand immediately and offer a fawning apology for his existence. His composure was irritating. "Darius?" She repeated the name as if it tasted strange. "Right. And you're here with—" She let the question hang in the air, her tone implying he couldn't possibly be here on his own merit. "I'm a guest of an employee at your husband's company," he answered, his voice still calm, giving away nothing. This was the answer she wanted. It confirmed her assumptions. He was a nobody. "I see," she said, the condescension in her voice growing thicker. "Well, I think there's been a bit of a mistake with the seating chart. This section is really reserved for close family and our most important guests." The insult was clear, wrapped in a thin veil of wedding planning logistics. Some of the guests nearby chuckled nervously, their eyes darting between the bride and the quiet man. Ryan, noticing the confrontation from across the room, started to look uneasy. He saw his new wife talking to the man, saw the crowd starting to form, and a knot of anxiety tightened in his stomach. He should go over there, but he was caught in a conversation with his own boss, unable to break away. Darius remained seated, his gaze steady. He gave a small, polite nod, as if considering her words. This unnerved Haley even more. He was supposed to be embarrassed, apologetic. Why wasn't he reacting? Why wasn't he shrinking under her gaze? She decided to push harder, to make the point so sharp he couldn't possibly ignore it. She placed a hand on her hip, her posture shifting from hostess to enforcer. "Don't take it personally," she said, her voice now carrying a distinct edge of mockery. "We're just trying to keep things classy." The final word landed with a heavy thud in the suddenly quiet space around the table. The nervous chuckles from the crowd grew a little louder, a pathetic and cruel chorus of support for the bride. The tension cracked. Guests who had been watching now looked away, suddenly finding their champagne glasses fascinating. They were embarrassed for him, but they were more afraid of her. Ryan's face was now flushed with discomfort. He knew this was wrong, but he was trapped by the social pressure of his own wedding. He was a man who avoided conflict, and his wife was an expert at creating it. Darius Cole finally broke the silence. He looked directly at Haley, his eyes holding a depth she couldn't begin to understand. There was no anger there, no shame, only a profound and unsettling calm. "I understand completely," he said. The words were simple, yet they felt like a judgment. His utter lack of reaction was a mirror, and for a fleeting moment, Haley saw a flash of her own ugliness reflected in it. It made her angrier than any shouting match ever could. The air around the table was thick with unspoken words. Haley's friends, a clutch of bridesmaids who mirrored her own sense of entitlement, gathered behind her like a pack of hyenas sensing a kill. They whispered and snickered, their eyes flicking towards Darius as if he were a piece of furniture that had been placed in the wrong room. They didn't even try to hide their disdain. He was an object of amusement, a brief and entertaining diversion from the champagne and small talk. Haley, emboldened by their support, decided to escalate. She was not just going to correct a seating error, she was going to make an example of him. She wanted to reassert her control over this perfect day, and he was the nail that needed to be hammered down. She flagged down a passing waiter, a young man with a nervous expression who was trying his best to remain invisible. He hurried over, his eyes wide. "Yes, Mrs. Monroe?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. Haley didn't even look at him. Her eyes were still locked on Darius, who had remained silent and still through the entire exchange. "There's been a mistake," she announced, her voice ringing with authority. "This guest needs to be moved. Take him to the staff section, please. I think there's a table for the vendors near the kitchen." The insult was no longer veiled. It was a direct, brutal shot. She was not just moving him, she was demoting him. She was classifying him as service staff, someone who worked for her, not someone who celebrated with her. The waiter, a young man named Sophie's colleague, froze. He looked from Haley's smug face to Darius's calm one. The injustice of the request was plain on his face. He was visibly uncomfortable, his hands trembling slightly as he held his silver tray. "Ma'am, I don't think I can," he stammered. Haley cut him off with a sharp wave of her hand. "It wasn't a request," she snapped. "The seating was meant for real guests." The phrase "real guests" hung in the air, heavy and poisonous. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the whispers from her friends died down. The guests at the nearby tables were now staring openly, their faces a mixture of shock and morbid curiosity. They were witnessing a car crash in slow motion and couldn't look away. Darius Cole finally moved. He didn't wait for the waiter to act. He didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice. With a slow, deliberate grace, he placed his napkin on the table and stood up. He was taller than Haley had realized, his presence filling the space in a way that made her feel small, despite being the one in power. He reached for the simple dark jacket that was draped over the back of his chair, his movements smooth and unhurried. He was collecting his things with a dignity that felt like a rebuke. He was taking control of his own exit, refusing to be escorted away like a child. Seeing him stand, seeing him prepare to leave, Haley felt a surge of triumph. She had won. She had restored order to her perfect world. She raised her champagne flute, the crystal catching the light, and clinked it against her husband's glass, who had finally managed to join her side. "It's fine," she said loudly, a triumphant laugh bubbling up from her chest. "It's his kind of crowd back there anyway." The laughter was sharp and cruel, and it echoed in the silent room. Cameras, drawn to the drama, flashed relentlessly, capturing the moment forever. The beautiful, laughing bride and the silent black man she had just banished. The insult landed like a physical slap. The remaining guests were stunned into a deeper silence. This had gone beyond a simple seating mix-up. This was a public humiliation, a cruel display of power for its own sake. Ryan's face was a mask of shame. He looked at his new wife, at the ugly triumph in her eyes, and then at the man she had just insulted. He wanted to say something, to apologize, to fix this, but the words were stuck in his throat. He was paralyzed by his own weakness. Darius, jacket now in hand, turned to leave. He didn't look at Haley. He didn't look at the crowd. He walked away without a single word. But as he passed a young waitress standing frozen by a service station, their eyes met for a brief second. The waitress, Sophie, saw everything in that look. There was no anger, there was no hatred. There was only a deep, profound, and perfectly controlled restraint. It was the look of a man who held back an ocean with a dam of sheer will. It was a look that promised that this was not over. Not by a long shot. Sophie watched him go, a shiver running down her spine. She had just witnessed an act of incredible cruelty, but she had also witnessed an act of incredible strength. And in that moment, she knew which one would ultimately win. Darius Cole walked through the grand arched doorway of the country club and into the cool night air. The sounds of forced laughter and tinkling glass faded behind him, replaced by the gentle chirping of crickets and the rustle of leaves in the manicured gardens. He didn't look back. The opulent mansion, glowing with a warm, artificial light, was a world he was happy to leave behind. A sleek black car, so dark it seemed to absorb the moonlight, pulled up to the curb the moment he stepped outside. The door was opened from the inside by a man in a sharp suit, his expression one of polite and unwavering respect. "Good evening, sir," said Charles Benton, his right-hand man and chief of staff. I trust the event was illuminating. Darius slid into the plush leather seat of the car. The interior was silent and cool, a stark contrast to the noisy, overheated reception hall. He took a deep breath, the first real breath he had taken all evening. He gazed out the window, his reflection a faint ghost against the image of the glowing mansion in the distance. The truth was, the event had been exactly what he had expected, and that was the most disappointing part of all. The man who had just been dismissed as a +1 nobody was Darius Cole, the founder and billionaire CEO of Cole Global Industries. He was the invisible force behind one of the world's most successful tech and logistics firms, the very company where the Groom, Ryan Monroe, worked as a mid-level senior project manager. He was a man who preferred to operate from the shadows, a quiet architect of a global empire. He valued substance over style, humility over arrogance, and character over connections. In recent months, whispers had reached him through the corporate grapevine. Reports of a toxic culture of elitism and subtle bias festering within his own leadership circles. He had heard stories of good people being overlooked, of a country club mentality taking root in the very company he had built on a foundation of merit. He couldn't prove it with data and spreadsheets alone. He needed to see it for himself. So he had arranged to attend the wedding, not as a CEO, but as the guest of a young, bright intern he had recently mentored. He had come undercover, a ghost in his own machine, to observe the culture of his people when they thought the boss wasn't watching. And tonight, his worst fears had been confirmed in the most public and ugly way imaginable. Haley Monroe had not just insulted a man. She had revealed a sickness that ran deep within the culture he was responsible for. He turned away from the window, his expression now hard and resolute. The time for quiet observation was over. It was time for action. "You were right, Charles," he said, his voice soft but absolute. "They had no idea who I was." Charles Benton nodded, his face grim. "Her name is Haley Monroe, his new wife. Her behavior was unacceptable, sir." Darius looked at his chief of staff, a man who had been with him for over 20 years, a man who understood his thinking better than anyone. It was more than unacceptable, Charles. It was a symptom of a disease, arrogance, entitlement, the belief that a person's worth is determined by their seat at the table. That is not the culture of Cole Global. And we will cut it out, starting at the root. He paused, his mind already moving, formulating a plan. The wheels were turning, quiet and powerful, like the engine of the car that was now speeding them away into the night. "Schedule a full company review meeting for Monday morning," he instructed. "I want all senior management and all department heads in attendance, no exceptions. Full attendance is mandatory." Charles was already typing the instructions into a secure tablet. "Yes, sir. Anything else?" Darius looked back towards the distant glow of the country club, a final, lingering glance. The calm before the storm was officially over. "Yes," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, cold and precise. "One more thing." The next morning, the sun streamed into the lavish hotel suite where the newlyweds were having brunch. The room was filled with flowers, discarded gift wrapping, and the lingering scent of celebration. Haley Monroe sat at a table surrounded by her bridesmaids, a mimosa in one hand, her new diamond ring catching the light with every gesture. She was recounting the events of the previous night, not with shame or regret, but with a giddy sense of accomplishment. She was the star of her own story, and last night she had delivered a spectacular performance. "And then I just told the waiter, 'Move him to the staff section,'" she said, a peal of laughter escaping her lips. You should have seen the look on his face. It was priceless. Her friends laughed along with her, their faces reflecting her own casual cruelty. They reenacted the scene, mimicking Darius's quiet demeanor and her own sharp retorts. It was a joke to them, a funny little anecdote from a perfect wedding. Ryan sat at the head of the table, a forced smile plastered on his face. He picked at his food, the taste of eggs and bacon turning to ash in his mouth. He had not slept well. The image of Darius's dignified retreat and the sound of his wife's mocking laughter had played on a loop in his mind all night. He felt a deep, gnawing discomfort, a feeling of shame that he couldn't quite articulate. He knew what Haley had done was wrong, but he had stood by and done nothing. His silence had made him an accomplice. "It was just so awkward," he said, trying to steer the conversation in a different direction. "We don't even know who that guy was." Haley waved her hand dismissively as if swatting away a fly. "Oh, please, Ryan, he was a nobody. An intern's date. If he were somebody important, I would know. Trust me." Her confidence was absolute, her worldview so narrow that it couldn't conceive of a reality where power didn't announce itself with loud fanfare and expensive accessories. One of the older guests, a cousin of Ryan's, nervously cleared his throat. "Are you sure?" he asked tentatively. "He looked familiar to me. I feel like I've seen his face before, maybe in a business journal or something." Haley rolled her eyes. The suggestion was absurd to her. "You're imagining things. He was probably a waiter at some other party you went to. Let's talk about something more important, like the honeymoon." But the seed of doubt had been planted. Emily, one of the younger bridesmaids who had been quiet throughout the conversation, looked down at her plate. She had been just as shocked as everyone else last night, but unlike the others, the feeling hadn't worn off. She felt a lingering sense of dread. "You know," she muttered almost to herself, her voice so low it was nearly lost in the chatter, "sometimes the ones you don't notice are the ones who are running everything." Haley heard her. She shot Emily a withering look, a silent warning to drop the subject. She would not let anyone cast a shadow on her perfect morning after. She turned her attention away from the conversation and picked up her phone, opening the camera app. She angled it to capture her face, her new ring, and the luxurious suite in the background. She admired her own reflection, the image of the perfect bride, the woman who had everything. She was so busy looking at herself that she didn't see the crack that was already forming in the foundation of her perfect life. She was too busy admiring the reflection to see the storm clouds gathering just beyond the window. Miles away, in a small apartment that was a world away from Haley's lavish hotel suite, Sophie the waitress was replaying the events of the wedding in her mind. She hadn't been able to sleep. The image of Haley's smug face and the sound of her cruel laughter were burned into her memory. But most of all, she remembered the look in Darius Cole's eyes. It was a look of immense control, of power held in reserve. It was a look that told her he was not a victim. She felt a knot of anger and frustration in her stomach. She had seen injustice before, the casual cruelty of the rich towards the people who served them. Usually she just had to swallow it, to put her head down and keep working because she needed the job. But this felt different. This was more public, more brutal, more wrong. She felt a desperate urge to do something, to not let that moment of humiliation simply disappear into the night. Then she remembered her phone. In the heat of the moment, as Haley had delivered her final crushing insult, Sophie had instinctively pulled out her phone. Shielded by the service station, she had recorded a short 10-second clip. It wasn't much, but it was everything. It captured the moment perfectly. Haley's mocking tone, the words "real guests," the triumphant laugh, and the shocked, silent faces of the people around her. She watched the clip over and over. The video quality was a bit shaky, the audio slightly muffled by the background noise, but the ugliness of the moment was crystal clear. A war was raging inside her. If she did something with this video, she could lose her job. The catering company had a strict no phones policy. She could be blacklisted, but if she did nothing, she would be just as bad as the silent guests who had stood by and let it happen. She would be another one of the people who let cruelty win because they were too afraid to speak up. She thought about the man. Darius. He had faced that humiliation with such dignity. He deserved some form of justice. Her mind was made up. She remembered seeing a corporate logo on the event checklist she'd been given at the start of her shift. It was the logo of the company that had paid for the wedding, the company where the groom worked. Cole Global. She didn't know what it would accomplish, but it was something. It was more than nothing. With trembling fingers, she opened her email. She created a new, anonymous account, something untraceable. She attached the short video clip. In the subject line, she wrote, "Concern regarding an incident at a company-sponsored event." In the body of the email, she typed a simple, anonymous message. "I believe this behavior does not reflect the values your company stands for." This took place at the Monroe wedding. She found the general corporate HR email address from a quick search online. She hesitated for a moment, her finger hovering over the send button. This was it. There was no going back. She took a deep breath and pressed send. The email shot out into the digital void, a tiny arrow of truth fired into the heart of a giant corporation. Hours later, in the sleek, quiet offices of Cole Global Industries, that email landed in a crowded inbox. It was flagged by an automated system, then forwarded to a senior HR manager who then, seeing the sensitive nature of the content, immediately forwarded it to the office of the Chief of Staff. Charles Benton saw the email pop up on his screen. He opened the video attachment and his face hardened. He recognized the bride instantly. He recognized the mocking tone of her voice. He had not been at the wedding himself, but Darius had already told him everything that had happened. This video was the proof. It was the objective, undeniable evidence of the rot Darius had gone to see for himself. He forwarded the email to Darius's personal, encrypted address with a single line of text. "Sir, you need to see this." Miles away in his private study, Darius Cole opened the email. He clicked on the video file. The small screen of his phone lit up with the scene from the wedding. He watched it silently. He heard the sound of Haley's voice, the laughter of the crowd, the ugly words that had been directed at him. He saw the flicker of shock and embarrassment on the faces of the guests. He watched the scene play out, not as the man who had lived it, but as the CEO who now had to deal with its fallout. He felt a cold, quiet anger settle in his chest. It was not a hot, fiery rage, but a deep, controlled burn. This was not just about a personal insult anymore. This was about his company, his legacy, his values. He watched the clip one more time, then closed his phone. He sat in the silence for a long moment. The trap was no longer just forming. It was now set, and it was ready to be sprung. He looked at the screen, at the arrogant, laughing face of the bride, and said to the empty room, "We will address this directly." The power of Darius Cole's empire was not in its towering skyscrapers or its billions in revenue. It was in its efficiency, its speed, and its absolute precision. His decisions were carried out with the swift, silent force of a tidal wave. After watching the video, he picked up his phone and made a single quiet call. It was not a long conversation. It was a series of direct, clear instructions delivered in a calm, unwavering tone. There was no room for misinterpretation. "Summon all department heads and senior management to the Monday review meeting," he said to his executive assistant, his voice as cool and sharp as cut glass. "The one we just scheduled, conference room 1, 9 a.m. sharp." His assistant, a woman who had worked for him for a decade, could hear the unusual tension in his voice. She knew this was not a standard review. "Yes, Mr. Cole," she replied, her pen flying across her notepad. "Is there a specific agenda I should circulate?" "The agenda is a corporate culture review," Darius stated flatly. "No other details are necessary, just ensure everyone is there." He paused for a beat, the silence deliberate and heavy. Then he delivered the final, critical instruction. "And one more thing. I want you to invite Ryan Monroe personally. He is a senior project manager in the logistics division. Call him directly. Tell him his presence is required, and make it clear that he should bring his wife, Haley." The executive assistant hesitated. This was a highly unusual request. Inviting a mid-level manager, let alone his spouse, to a meeting with the entire senior leadership team was unheard of. It broke every protocol. His wife, sir?" she asked, just to be certain she had heard correctly. "Yes," Darius confirmed, his voice leaving no room for argument. "Both of them. Monday morning, 9 a.m. "Of course, Mr. Cole," she said, recovering quickly. She knew better than to question a direct order from him. When Darius Cole gave an instruction like this, there was always a powerful reason. She just knew that whatever that reason was, it was not going to be pleasant for Mr. and Mrs. Monroe. Darius ended the call and placed his phone face down on the polished mahogany desk. He leaned back in his chair, his hands steepled in front of him. His face was emotionless, a mask of calm control. But inside, a quiet storm was raging. He took no pleasure in what was about to happen. He was not a man who enjoyed revenge. He was a man who believed in consequences. Haley and Ryan Monroe had made a choice on Saturday night. They had chosen arrogance over kindness, cruelty over respect. Now, on Monday morning, they would face the consequences of that choice. The power shift had already begun. It had started the moment Sophie pressed send on that email. It had solidified the moment he made that phone call. The corporate machine of Cole Global was now moving, its gears turning to carry out his will. For Haley and Ryan, the world was about to be turned upside down. They just didn't know it yet. Monday morning arrived with a crisp, clear sky, the kind of day that promises new beginnings. For Ryan and Haley Monroe, it felt like the first real day of the rest of their lives. The honeymoon was booked, the wedding gifts were waiting to be opened, and their future seemed as bright and polished as the city skyline. Ryan had received the call from the CEO's office on Sunday afternoon. He had been shocked and a little terrified. A personal invitation to a meeting with the entire senior leadership team was a massive deal. But the fear was quickly replaced by a surge of excitement. Maybe this was about a promotion, a huge new project. He was finally being recognized. The request to bring Haley was strange, but he rationalized it. Maybe the company wanted to congratulate them on their marriage. Maybe the CEO was a family man and wanted to meet the spouse of a rising star. Haley was even more excited. A meeting at the corporate headquarters, with the top executives, this was the world she belonged in. She spent over an hour that morning picking out the perfect outfit. A designer business dress, sharp heels, and a handbag that cost more than most people's rent. She was ready to play the part of the powerful executive's wife. As they walked into the lobby of the Cole Global skyscraper, a towering monument of glass and steel, Haley held her husband's arm with a confident grip. The lobby was vast and impressive, with a marble floor that gleamed under the recessed lighting. A massive silver logo was mounted on the wall behind the reception desk. It read, Cole Global. Haley stopped dead in her tracks. A cold feeling, sharp and unpleasant, pricked at the back of her neck. Cole. The name felt strangely familiar. A fuzzy, half-formed memory tried to surface, but she pushed it down. It was probably just a common name. "Wait," she stammered, her voice suddenly uncertain. She turned to Ryan, her perfectly made-up face etched with confusion. "Cole Global? This is your company? I thought you worked for a subsidiary." Ryan nodded nervously, his own excitement now tinged with the familiar anxiety he always felt in this building. This was the big leagues. "This is the parent company, the headquarters. I've only been in this building a few times. It's a lot." Haley's mind was racing. Cole. Where had she heard that name? Why did it send a shiver of dread down her spine? She couldn't place it. The feeling was unsettling, like trying to remember a bad dream. They checked in at the security desk and were given visitor passes. As they rode the silent, high-speed elevator up to the 50th floor, Haley could feel the atmosphere changing. The air grew thinner, more charged. Upstairs, in the executive wing, executives were already whispering. The news had spread like wildfire. Ryan Monroe and his new wife, the bride from that shocking video clip, were on their way up. The video, which Charles Benton had discreetly circulated among a few key senior leaders, had done its job. The air in the hallways was thick with a mixture of tension, curiosity, and a sense of impending doom. Everyone knew this was not a normal meeting. This was a reckoning. When Ryan and Haley stepped out of the elevator, a junior executive was waiting to escort them to the boardroom. He greeted them with a polite but cold formality. He didn't smile. As they walked down the long, carpeted hallway, Haley noticed the way people looked at them. Executives in expensive suits would pause their conversations as they passed, their eyes following her. Their expressions were not friendly or congratulatory. They were guarded, judgmental. Some of them looked at her with open pity. Haley's confidence began to crumble. The designer dress suddenly felt like a costume. The expensive handbag felt heavy and ridiculous. She sensed that something was terribly, terribly wrong. She was no longer an honored guest. She felt like a specimen under a microscope being observed by a room full of scientists. "Ryan," she whispered, her voice tight with panic. "What is going on? Why is everyone looking at me like that?" Ryan, equally bewildered and increasingly terrified, could only shake his head. "I don't know," he mumbled, his own bravado having completely evaporated. "I have no idea." The escort led them to a pair of massive oak doors at the end of the hall. He pushed one open, revealing the boardroom. It was a vast, intimidating space, dominated by a long, polished table that could seat 30 people. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a breathtaking view of the city below. But Haley didn't see the view. All she saw were the faces around the table. Every seat was filled. Every senior executive. Every department head. Every powerful person in Ryan's entire corporate world was there, sitting in absolute silence, waiting for them. The room was a tomb. And as she stepped across the threshold, she felt like she was walking into her own funeral. The boardroom at Cole Global was a place of power. The air itself seemed to hum with the energy of the billion-dollar decisions that were made within its walls. Today, however, the energy was different. It was not the hum of commerce, but the tense, dead silence of a courtroom awaiting a verdict. Every seat was filled with the most influential people in the company. They were men and women who were used to being in command. But today they sat perfectly still, their faces grim, their eyes fixed on the two empty chairs at the far end of the long table. Ryan and Haley were led to those chairs. The walk across the room felt like a mile. The silence was a physical weight pressing down on them. Every footstep echoed. Haley's heart was pounding against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat in the suffocating quiet. She sat down, her movements stiff and awkward. Ryan sat beside her, his hand trembling so badly he had to hide it under the table. He avoided making eye contact with anyone, especially his own direct superiors, who stared at him with expressions of cold disappointment. The screens on the wall, which usually displayed market data and sales projections, now showed only the stoic silver logo of Cole Global. The room waited. Haley looked at the faces around the table. She saw confusion. She saw anger. And in some, she saw a kind of grim satisfaction. But most of all, she saw fear. These powerful people were afraid, and that terrified her more than anything. What could possibly make all of them so afraid? The door at the head of the room opened. A man in a sharp suit walked in. It was Charles Benton, the chief of staff. He stood at the head of the table, his presence commanding immediate respect. "Good morning, everyone," he said, his voice calm and steady. "Thank you for your prompt attendance. We are here today for a critical review of our corporate culture. To lead this discussion, please welcome our CEO." He paused, turning towards the door. "Please welcome Mr. Darius Cole." The door opened again, and the man who walked in was the man from the wedding, the man she had called a nobody, the man she had ordered to be moved to the staff section. It was him. Haley's world tilted on its axis. The blood drained from her face, leaving her pale and cold. Her mouth fell open slightly, a silent gasp of disbelief. A roaring sound filled her ears, drowning out everything else. It couldn't be. It was impossible. This quiet, unassuming man could not be the CEO of this massive global corporation. It had to be a mistake, a cruel, elaborate prank. But then he walked to the head of the table, and the entire room of powerful executives seemed to shrink in his presence. He wasn't wearing the simple suit from the wedding. He was dressed in a sharp, charcoal gray suit that fit him perfectly. He moved with an easy, understated confidence, the kind of confidence that doesn't need to be announced. It was the confidence of a man who owned the room, who owned the building, who owned everything. He took his place at the head of the table. The room was so silent you could hear a pin drop. Haley's jaw was still hanging open, her mind struggling to process the impossible reality in front of her. Her pulse was racing, each beat a painful throb in her temples. She felt a wave of nausea wash over her. Ryan's hand, which she now grabbed under the table, was ice-cold and trembling uncontrollably. His face was a mask of pure, unadulterated horror. He looked like a man who had just seen a ghost. Darius Cole stood for a moment, his gaze sweeping across the room. He acknowledged his senior team with a slight nod. His expression was calm, professional, and completely unreadable. Then his eyes moved down the length of the long table until they locked with hers. It was the same look he had given her at the wedding, the same deep, controlled restraint. But this time, she understood what it meant. It was the look of a king observing a fool. It was the look of absolute power. "Let's begin," he said, his voice quiet, yet it carried to every corner of the silent room. And with those two simple words, Haley's perfectly constructed world began to shatter. The meeting began with a cold, clinical precision. Darius Cole did not raise his voice. He did not mention the wedding. He spoke about the core values of Cole Global: integrity, respect, and meritocracy. He talked about the importance of a culture where every employee, from the intern to the CEO, felt valued and seen. His voice was even and measured, but there was an undercurrent of steel that made every word land with the force of a hammer blow. The executives around the table listened in rapt silence, many of them shifting uncomfortably in their seats. They knew this was more than a lecture. This was a warning. Haley sat frozen in her chair, the words washing over her in a meaningless blur. Her mind was still reeling from the shock. The +1 nobody was the CEO. The man she had humiliated in front of everyone was the one who held her husband's career, their entire future, in the palm of his hand. The sheer cosmic irony of it was so overwhelming that she felt a hysterical laugh bubbling in her throat, but she choked it down. It came out as a small, pathetic sob. Ryan sat beside her, his head bowed, his face buried in his hands. He was drowning in a sea of shame and regret. He remembered every single moment from the wedding, Haley's cruel words, the laughter of the crowd, and his own cowardly silence. He had stood by and let it happen, and now his cowardice was about to cost him everything. About 30 minutes into the meeting, after laying the groundwork of his company's philosophy, Darius paused. He looked at Charles Benton, who gave a subtle nod. "Charles," Darius said, "please bring up the file I sent you this morning, the one labeled Case Study." Charles typed a command into his laptop. The massive projector screen behind Darius, which had been displaying the company logo, flickered and changed. An image appeared. It was a still frame from a video, slightly grainy, taken from a low angle. It was a picture of Haley, her face twisted in a smug, arrogant smile, her hand on her hip standing over a seated man whose back was to the camera. Haley's breath hitched in her throat. She knew that image. She knew that dress. She knew that moment. Gasps echoed around the boardroom. People who hadn't seen the video yet were now staring at the screen in disbelief. The executives who had seen it looked down at the table, their faces grim. Darius let the image hang in the air for a long, torturous moment. Then he said, his voice still perfectly calm, "Let's watch." And then he played the video. Sophie's short 10-second recording filled the state-of-the-art boardroom. The audio was crystal clear through the expensive sound system. Haley's mocking voice, sharp and cruel, echoed in the dead silence. The seating was meant for real guests. Then came her triumphant, ugly laugh. The sound was monstrous, amplified 100 times over in this room of judgment. Ryan flinched as if he had been physically struck. He couldn't bear to look at the screen. He squeezed his eyes shut, but he couldn't block out the sound of his wife's voice, the sound of his own silent complicity. The executives exchanged looks of horror. They were watching a public execution. The video ended, and the screen went black. But Darius wasn't finished. He paused the clip at the most damning moment, the exact frame where Haley sneered, "We're just trying to keep things classy." Her face, frozen on the giant screen, was a grotesque caricature of wealth and entitlement. The silence that followed was suffocating. It was heavier and more profound than any sound could ever be. It was the silence of absolute shame. Darius Cole let the silence stretch, forcing every single person in that room to sit with the ugliness of what they had just seen. He let Haley and Ryan stew in their own humiliation. Finally, he spoke, his voice even and devoid of any emotion. It made his words cut even deeper. "This," he said, gesturing to the screen, "is not a personal issue. This is a corporate issue. This is what happens when arrogance blinds empathy. This is what happens when we forget that our titles and our bank accounts do not make us better than anyone else." He looked around the table, his gaze piercing, making eye contact with each of his senior leaders. This is not just about one person's bad behavior. It's about the culture we tolerate. The culture that allows someone to believe this is acceptable. The culture that allows others to stand by and laugh, or to say nothing at all. His eyes finally settled on Haley. Her face was a mess of tear-streaked makeup. Her lips trembled. I didn't know," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I didn't know who you were." Darius's expression remained unchanged. He gave a slow, deliberate nod. "That," he replied, his voice dropping to a quiet, lethal tone, "is the entire point." The words landed, and in that moment, Haley understood. It wasn't about who he was. It was about who she was, and what she was ugly. The dam of Haley's composure finally broke. The carefully constructed facade of the perfect, powerful woman crumbled into dust, revealing the scared, entitled child underneath. A raw, guttural sob escaped her lips, and she dissolved into a flood of tears. They streamed down her face, carving black channels through her expensive foundation. Her body shook with uncontrollable sobs. It was not a quiet, dignified cry. It was a complete and total collapse. "I'm sorry," she wailed, her words thick and choked with tears. "I am so, so sorry. Please, you have to forgive me. It was just a joke, a stupid, terrible joke." She turned to the executives around the table, her eyes pleading for mercy, for anyone to come to her defense, but they all looked away. They stared at their notes, at the table, at the floor. No one would meet her gaze. She was a pariah, an infection that they were all desperate to avoid. Darius Cole looked at her, his face a mask of stone. He was unflinching. He let her cries echo in the silent room for a moment before he spoke. His voice was not loud, but it cut through her sobs like a surgeon's scalpel. "Respect isn't a joke, Mrs. Monroe," he said, his words precise and cold. "Dignity is not a punchline. They are a mirror. They reflect who we are. And yours just shattered." The words struck Haley with such force that her crying stopped for a second, replaced by a sharp, horrified intake of breath. She had been begging for forgiveness, but he was offering only judgment. He then turned his attention to Ryan. Ryan, who had been hiding behind his hands, slowly lowered them. His face was pale and slick with a cold sweat. He looked like a man on death row, waiting for the final verdict. Darius's gaze was not angry. It was worse. It was filled with a profound and utter disappointment. "As for you, Mr. Monroe," Darius said, his voice quiet but carrying the weight of finality, "this company prides itself on leadership. We expect our senior managers to lead by example, to uphold our values not just in this office, but in the world. We expect them to have the courage to speak up when they see injustice." He paused, letting the words sink in. "I expected leadership from you, Mr. Monroe, not silence." Ryan bowed his head, the weight of his shame too heavy to bear. He couldn't speak. There was nothing to say. He had failed the test. He had failed as a leader, as a husband, and as a man. He had stood by and watched his wife be cruel, and his silence was his confession. Darius turned to the head of Human Resources, who was sitting near the end of the table. "Please escort Mr. and Mrs. Monroe from the building," he instructed, his tone now purely professional. "And process the termination of Mr. Monroe's contract, effective immediately." The words "effective immediately" hung in the air like the toll of a funeral bell. Haley gasped, her eyes flying wide with disbelief. This couldn't be happening. "No," she cried out, her voice raw with panic. "You can't fire him. We just got married. We have a mortgage, a future." Her pleas were desperate, stripped of all her earlier arrogance. She was no longer the queen of the country club. She was just a woman watching her life fall apart. Darius Cole looked at her one last time. There was no pity in his eyes, only a quiet, resolute finality. "Then, perhaps," he replied, his voice dropping to an almost gentle whisper, "you will have plenty of time to reflect on the importance of character together." The room remained silent. HR personnel and security guards materialized by the door, their presence a clear and final signal that the meeting, and the Monroes' life as they knew it, was over. They stood up, their movements slow and heavy, like people moving through water. As they were led out of the room, not a single person defended them. Not a single executive offered a word of comfort. They just watched them go, their faces a mixture of relief and fear. The disease had been identified, and it had been ruthlessly cut out. Later that afternoon, the storm had passed. The tension that had gripped the executive floor had eased, replaced by a quiet, focused energy. Darius Cole sat in his spacious corner office, the city skyline spread out before him like a kingdom. The view was a testament to his success, but he found no joy in it today. He had not enjoyed firing Ryan Monroe. He had not enjoyed humiliating Haley. He had done what was necessary, not what was pleasant. There was one final piece of business to attend to. He buzzed his assistant. "Please send in Sophie Lane," he said. A few minutes later, there was a soft knock on his door. Sophie entered the office, her eyes wide with a mixture of awe and terror. She clutched her worn-out handbag to her chest like a shield. She was still wearing her simple waitress uniform, having been called in directly from the catering company's head office. She thought she was here to be fired or perhaps even sued for filming at the wedding. She had been bracing herself for the worst all day. Darius stood up from behind his massive desk and walked towards her, his hand extended. "Sophie," he said, his voice warm and genuine, "please come in. Have a seat. My name is Darius Cole." Sophie shook his hand tentatively. His grip was firm and reassuring. She sat on the edge of a plush leather chair, looking small and out of place in the cavernous office. "Sir," she began, her voice trembling, "I am so sorry about the video. I know I shouldn't have, but I couldn't stand by and—" Darius held up a hand, stopping her. He smiled, a faint but genuine smile that transformed his serious face. "You have nothing to apologize for," he said gently. "On the contrary, I asked you here today to thank you." Sophie stared at him, her brow furrowed in confusion. "Thank me?" she whispered. "Yes," he said, his expression turning serious again. "You did something that no one else in that room had the courage to do. You saw an injustice and you refused to be a silent witness. People like you, people with integrity and courage, are the ones who make any kind of justice possible." He walked back to his desk and picked up a folder. "I had my team look into your work history, Sophie. You've been with the catering company for 5 years. You have excellent reviews. You're hardworking, reliable, and you clearly have a strong moral compass." He opened the folder. "This company runs dozens of charity events, galas, and community outreach programs every year through our foundation. These events require careful planning, empathy, and a deep understanding of people. We need a director to oversee them." He looked directly at her, his gaze clear and steady. "I am offering you that position. A full-time job as the event director for the Cole Global Foundation. It comes with a full benefits package and a salary that is considerably more than what you are making now." Sophie's jaw dropped. Tears welled up in her eyes. But these were not tears of fear or sadness. They were tears of shock and overwhelming gratitude. She was speechless. She just shook her head, unable to believe what she was hearing. "Sir, I don't know what to say," she finally managed to stammer out, wiping a tear from her cheek. "I just did what I thought was right. I just couldn't stand watching what she did to you." Darius gave another small smile. He closed the folder and pushed it across the desk towards her. "And that, Sophie," he said softly, "is exactly why you deserve to stand with us." The sun began to set, painting the city in hues of orange and purple. Darius Cole stood at the floor-to-ceiling window of his office, looking out over the endless grid of streets and lights. His reflection stared back at him from the glass, a silhouette of a man whose power was not defined by his wealth, but by his unwavering character. He had not sought revenge. He had simply demanded accountability. He had held up a mirror, and the world had seen the truth. Down below, in the city he had helped to build, life went on. But for some, life had changed forever. The final scene cuts away from the powerful CEO and back to a small, darkened apartment. Haley Monroe sits alone on a couch, her face puffy and stained with ruined makeup. The designer dress from this morning is tossed carelessly over a chair. Her phone is in her hand, the screen glowing in the dim light. She is scrolling, her thumb moving numbly through social media feeds. She sees posts about her wedding, but now they are filled with comments about her behavior. The video Sophie took has gone viral. Her name, her face, her cruelty are now public knowledge. Her perfect image is shattered, replaced by the ugly truth of who she really is. Her humiliation is complete and absolute. She is no longer the bride, the queen, the center of the universe. She is just a woman, alone in the dark, scrolling through the wreckage of her own making. The story ends not on her pain, but on the quiet strength of the man she underestimated. The final image returns to Darius Cole, standing in his office, a faint, calm smile on his face as he looks out at the city. He is the man who needed no revenge, only the truth, because he understood the ultimate moral of power. Power doesn't come from money or titles or status. It doesn't come from a fancy dress or a seat at the VIP table. True power comes from character. It comes from dignity, from respect, and from the quiet courage to be humble in a world that rewards arrogance. The same people you look down on, the same people you mock and dismiss today, may very well be the ones who hold your entire future in their hands tomorrow. If this story about dignity and justice moved you, don't forget to subscribe for more inspiring stories like this one. What would you have done in this situation? Let us know below.